Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today here at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. My name is Rupal Mehta, and I am the Chair of Research in the Postdoctoral Fellows Program and a Senior Fellow at the Center, and I'll be moderating the lecture today. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome our speaker and my dear friend, Matthew Fuhrmann. Matt is the Cullen McFadden Professor of Political Science at Texas A&M and has been a visiting professor at both Yale and Stanford University. He was also named an Andrew Carnegie Fellow in 2016 by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Matt's talk introduces his most recent book, Influence Without Arms: The New Logic of Nuclear Deterrence, with Cambridge University Press. This book explores states that have the technology to build nuclear bombs but choose not to. Matt's work uses new statistical and case study evidence to demonstrate that nuclear latency can work to enhance deterrence and provides greater influence, but it may also inadvertently trigger conflict in arms races. The research also offers a framework to explain when nuclear latency increases security, when it incites instability, and is useful in generating new insights into deterrence, nuclear proliferation, arms races, preventive war, and disarmament. Matt has written widely on a range of nuclear issues, including 3 other recent books: Nuclear Weapons and Coercive Diplomacy, The Nuclear Renaissance in International Security, and his first book, Atomic Assistance, as well as a whole host of other articles that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. This talk will follow the format of other CGSR seminars. Matt will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will start the Q&A. During his talk, please feel free to get your questions into the chat, and you can start raising your hands electronically while Matt is speaking. So thank you, Matt, for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you, Rupal, for the invitation to be here and for the warm introduction. It's great to be here speaking on a topic where you also, Rupal, have made important contributions, and that is in the area of nuclear latency. So I'm excited to be here to talk about the newly published book, Influence Without Arms. To set this up, let's look at the existing literature about nuclear deterrence within political science. There's been, of course, volumes and volumes written on this topic since the Cold War. Now, almost all of the work in this arena assumes that to have any hope of using a nuclear program for deterrence or for international leverage, you have to have a minimum of at least one assembled nuclear weapon. And so the focus in existing research has been on the countries armed with nuclear arsenals, like the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. What I wanted to do in this book is to talk about a different group of countries that I think is important but has been relatively neglected. And that's the countries that have the technological capacity to make nuclear weapons if they so desired, but they've chosen not to, at least for now. These countries are said to have what we call nuclear latency. And I'm going to refer to these nuclear capable countries as latent nuclear powers. Japan is a classic example of a latent nuclear power in the world today. Because of the dual-use technology it possesses from its civilian nuclear program, it's widely understood that Japan could build nuclear weapons relatively easily if it ever faced a political environment where it wanted to. Journalists and others sometimes say that Japan is merely a screwdriver's turn away from a nuclear bomb. This is a bit of an exaggeration, but the basic idea is that some countries in the world, because of their underlying dual-use nuclear programs, could build nuclear weapons in relatively short order. And these are the countries that are the focus of the book. Japan is hardly alone in terms of a country that has developed this capability. For the project, I collected new data on the possession of sensitive dual-use nuclear technology. And here I'm talking specifically about uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing capabilities. We've identified 33 countries that have had some form of enrichment or reprocessing capability in the nuclear age. And what you can see in this chart here is that in almost every year of the nuclear age, the number of states with latency exceeds the number of countries that actually had nuclear weapons. So the trend suggests that a growing number of states throughout the nuclear age have developed this capability. And that's one reason why I think it's important that we understand more about this particular group of countries. Now, despite the importance of this issue, the topic of nuclear latency has been relatively neglected in scholarship and also in the policymaking world. Here's a quotation that I'm showing you from 1997 that exemplifies this point. Now, many of you probably know the author of this statement from 1997. It is Brad Roberts. And I would argue that although that was written several decades ago, the basic sentiment still holds true in the sense that there's lots of countries in the world that historically and today have the capability to make nuclear weapons in short order. And there's also the potential that they can exploit this capacity for political or diplomatic leverage, but yet we still don't really understand how exactly that might work. So what I want to do in the book is to take a deep dive on this issue and give us a deeper appreciation of the issue of nuclear latency. Now, this issue has not been totally ignored in scholarship. Thankfully, there's been a number of studies in recent years that have substantially enhanced our understanding of the role of nuclear latency in world politics. And that includes work by Rupal Mehta, Tristan Volpe, Rachel Whitlark, and others. So I'm trying to build on this emerging literature to give us a deeper appreciation of the role of nuclear latency in international relations. The book is going to focus on something that I call latent nuclear deterrence. And when I use that term, I'm talking about the use of a non-weaponized nuclear program to try and achieve greater influence internationally. Some policymakers around the world have expressed the view that they think latent nuclear deterrence can be effective. For example, former Director General of the IAEA, Mohammed Al-Bardai, once wrote that if you're really smart, you don't need to develop a nuclear weapon, you just develop that dual-use capability, and that is the best deterrence. So there's this sense percolating in the policymaking community that latent nuclear deterrence might be effective, but we really don't understand fully whether this is true, and especially the conditions under which it might be true. So in my talk today, I want to leave you with 5 main points that come out of the book. First, I want to show you evidence that leaders around the world, historically and today, have routinely used a strategy of latent deterrence to try and gain greater international influence. Second, that many leaders from a diverse set of countries believe that this is an effective strategy. In other words, that it works. The third key takeaway is I'll lay out a basic theory that helps us understand the conditions under which this strategy might be effective. Fourth, I'll show you some evidence that latent deterrence can indeed be effective, but only sometimes. There are certain conditions that have to be present in order for countries to reap benefits from a non-weaponized nuclear program. And then fifth and finally, I'll talk about some of the big policy questions that the book speaks to. So let's start with the first takeaway, which is that leaders try this strategy. They attempt to use nuclear latency in order to extract greater international influence. The book unpacks 20 case studies in total to try and suss out the ways in which leaders use this strategy. I won't go into all of the case studies here, but I do want to give you a flavor of some of the evidence that exists from the book. So I'll talk briefly about 3 cases. The first is from the case of Japan, where we've had various policymakers over a period of several decades try and use Japan's civilian nuclear program to gain greater international influence. And here's just one example from an unnamed official in the Ministry of Defense who said, quote, "If a North Korean missile, even one with no nuclear component, hits Japanese soil, I think the process of building nuclear weapons will begin." So what the official is trying to do here is to use the fact that Japan could build nuclear weapons relatively quickly to deter North Korea from launching a military attack. We also see evidence of leaders trying this strategy in the case of Iran. Here's one indication of this from former President Rafsanjani, who said, quote, "Once we have mastery of the fuel cycle, meaning once we have a viable full-scale enrichment program that could potentially produce fissile material for a bomb, all of our neighbors will draw the proper conclusion. To dare to attack Iran would be foolhardy." So Rafsanjani wasn't saying Iran needs a nuclear weapon to deter. He was saying that the mere technological capability to be able to do that would provide a deterrent and would dissuade other countries from attacking Iran. The third example I want to highlight today comes from the case of North Korea. In the early 2000s, before North Korea's first nuclear test, a group of Americans, including Siegfried Hecker, the former head of Los Alamos National Lab, visited North Korea. And while they were there on this particular visit, they toured some of North Korea's plutonium production facilities. And while there, Hecker and his colleagues were presented with a glass jar containing North Korean-made plutonium. After seeing this, the visiting Americans were then speaking with a North Korean official who told them that now they had seen, quote, their deterrent. But Hecker and his colleagues had not actually seen any nuclear weapons. They hadn't seen any missiles or any relevant delivery systems. All they had seen is that North Korea knew how to make plutonium. But apparently, the North Koreans felt that this was alone sufficient to gain leverage over the United States, because their hope was that Hecker and his colleagues would take this information back to Washington and explain to US officials that North Korea definitely could make plutonium, and the North Koreans believed that this information would give them leverage over the United States. So when we look throughout history, the harder we look and the deeper we look, the more examples like these we find, where countries are attempting to use their nuclear programs for political leverage, even though they don't have assembled nuclear weapons. The next question is, we know that leaders do this, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's an effective strategy. So we want to now understand whether this strategy works. And the first step to answering this that I take in the book is to look at what leaders actually believe. So here I look specifically within 10 countries to try and tease out what leaders think about latent deterrence as an effective strategy. And here again, rather than going in detail into all 10 cases, I'm going to give you a flavor of some of the evidence from 3 of the cases. Brazil is an interesting case where we have a growing number of newly available, formerly secret government documents that we can access that help us understand a lot that we didn't previously know about Brazil's nuclear program. So like Japan and others, Brazil is a country that is considered a latent nuclear power because of its underlying uranium enrichment capabilities. One of the documents that I read from the late 1970s pointed to Brazil's emerging nuclear latency as something that, quote, increases the political economic bargaining power for the country. So not just in this document, but in others that I accessed as well, there's evidence that throughout the history of their enrichment program, Brazilian officials saw leverage and influence to be gained from having the capability to make fissile material, even if Brazil never went on to actually assemble nuclear weapons. Returning to the case of Japan, we see evidence here from 2 former defense ministers expressing confidence in the idea that latent deterrence works. One said that nuclear latency has, quote, very great defensive deterrent functions, and another wrote that Japan's nuclear program provided the country with, quote, a tacit nuclear deterrent. So in the Japanese case, like the Brazilian one, there's a substantial amount of qualitative evidence pointing to the view that latent deterrence is an effective strategy, at least in the eyes of government officials in these countries. Spain is an interesting case. And it's one that is not as well known and is widely studied in the United States and in other English language sources. But it's one where there was a reprocessing program that dates back to the 1960s, and also flirtation with nuclear weapons during this period as well, although Spain never had a Manhattan Project style program to produce a bomb. It was more a case of nuclear hedging rather than trying to build a nuclear weapon as quickly as possible. But when we look at the Spanish case, we find evidence, like in the other two cases I've talked about, that officials in the country saw political leverage to be gained from having the means to make fissile material. And in this particular example from the Spanish newspaper El País, there's a particular reference to Spain's dual-use nuclear facilities providing a powerful deterrent against the North African countries. And at the time this was all going on, Spain was worried about potential conflict, military conflict with countries in North Africa, and saw its latency as having potential from a deterrence standpoint in terms of managing its interactions with those states. So when we look at a broad swath of evidence in these three countries I've mentioned, as well as others explored in the book, there's good reason to believe that at the very least there's plausibility to this idea of latent nuclear deterrence, that many leaders in a diverse set of countries believe that it could be effective. So I take this as a plausibility probe of sorts to say that this qualitative evidence suggests that there's something to this that's worthy of further examination. And so then the next step is to think in a little bit more detail, first on the theoretical side, about how exactly this could work. Because even the government officials in the US and elsewhere who make claims that they think latent deterrence is effective usually don't spell out exactly why they think it works. And so it's not always clear how exactly you convert nuclear latency into meaningful political leverage. So one thing I'm trying to do in the book is a brush clearing exercise of sorts where I think through the mechanisms by which latent deterrence could work. But before I get to that, it's important to point out that others have thought about this issue as well. And when we look at work on this subject, especially recent work, we see some skepticism about whether latent deterrence can be an effective strategy. For example, the political scientist Kenneth Waltz has written that a latent deterrent is at best a shaky one. Along similar lines, Rupal Mehta and Rachel Whitlark, in an important study published in International Studies Quarterly, concluded that countries suffer more burdens than benefits once they acquire nuclear latency. Contributing to this skeptical view, Matthew Koenig wrote that to suggest that countries like Iran or Japan, by stopping a screwdriver's turn away from the bomb, could somehow get what they want is ridiculous. So there's a lot of commentary out there pointing to the notion that latent deterrence maybe isn't an effective strategy. When we look at writing and thinking on this issue, it's often painted in black and white terms. True, in order for latent deterrence to work. And in thinking about it in this way, I think we can better understand when latency leads to problematic or destabilizing outcomes, and when it might give countries political leverage internationally. The approach I take to get to that point is first to think about the different mechanisms that could underlie latent deterrence. And I identify three distinct but related mechanisms, which I call deterrence by proliferation, delayed attack, and doubt. The means of punishment varies across these mechanisms, but something that is distinct about it compared to traditional deterrence is that there's usually a perceived time delay in punishment, meaning that the country making the threat couldn't actually carry it out immediately because they lack the capabilities to do so at the present moment. In deterrence by proliferation, countries are threatening to build nuclear weapons if there's some challenge to the status quo that threatens their interests. Importantly, they're not necessarily threatening to use those nuclear weapons. So the threat here is to possess the bomb, to proliferate, not necessarily to use it. As long as the target of that threat sees the country's possession of nuclear weapons as undesirable, then this can give the latent power some leverage potential. And the other two mechanisms, delayed attack and doubt, the means of punishment, just like in traditional deterrence, would be an actual nuclear attack. In deterrence by delayed attack, a latent power would threaten to use nuclear weapons with a time delay. So if there's an invasion or other kind of military conflict, the idea would be that the latent state would quickly assemble one or more nuclear weapons in a matter of days, weeks, or months. And then as long as the conflict wasn't over before they could assemble a weapon, they could then use that weapon eventually in the conflict. And the idea here is that the potential aggressor would anticipate this at the outset and factor it into their calculus and potentially be deterred. In deterrence by doubt, this happens when a latent power is so close to a bomb that it might be difficult for a potential attacker to fully rule out the possibility that it might already have one or more nuclear weapons. So you can think about India and Pakistan in the late 1980s as cases where they just got really close to a bomb, and it was very difficult to know for sure whether or not they were still completely non-nuclear. So in this kind of situation, even if a country doesn't have nuclear weapons assembled, the possibility that they might have already assembled one or more bombs might provide a deterrent. So thinking about these three mechanisms, the book tries to unpack the conditions under which they could be successful. To do this, I take a two-pronged approach. First, I think through the major challenges that countries face when they try to use nuclear latency to gain political leverage. And then second, I think about whether there are possible solutions to those problems or challenges. And in doing this, I'm able to identify some conditions that I think need to be present in order for countries to have any hope of succeeding in this strategy. So what are the problems? A big one, which I alluded to already, is that punishment is delayed in latent deterrence. It's not immediate. And this can be problematic because it provides potential challengers to the status quo with opportunities to believe that they can escape punishment, that they could somehow take some aggressive action and then prevent the latent power from being able to carry out its threat. And so if a challenger believes it can escape punishment, it's going to heavily discount potential punishment costs, thereby weakening deterrence. Another problem is that carrying out these threats could be very costly for the latent nuclear power, not just the country that would be the target of these threats. And because the costs of carrying out these threats can be quite substantial, countries might view threats along these lines as not credible or not believable. And this can undermine the efficacy of latent deterrence. And third, pursuing this strategy, instead of bringing stability and influence, it could actually incite instability for the latent nuclear power. It could trigger preventive war, for example, or an arms race. And so by developing nuclear latency and attempting this strategy, countries might actually foment insecurity rather than security. So the next step, as I said, is to think about whether these issues can be addressed. And I argue that they can to some degree, but it requires requirements that are difficult to satisfy. So the first one is that countries have to have a viable large-scale enrichment or reprocessing capability that gives them the means to make it fissile material for at least one bomb. And that's because if they lack that capability, they're going to be too far away from a nuclear weapon to be able to use that threat to gain leverage. So we know that there are 3 steps to making a nuclear bomb. Getting the fissile material is the first, weaponizing the fissile material is the second, and then mating the weapon to a delivery system is the third. And of those three steps, it's widely understood that the first is the most difficult, that is getting the fissile material. So if you already have it, or if you can produce it pretty quickly, then you've overcome probably the most significant challenge in terms of making a nuclear weapon, and you're going to be in a better position to be able to use that as political leverage. Second, you need to have high stakes for this to be an effective strategy, and that's important because without high stakes, threats along these lines might be dismissed as not believable. But with high stakes, they might be seen as more credible. And third, importantly, especially if countries are relying on deterrence by proliferation, they have to credibly demonstrate what I call nuclear restraint. That is, they can't be seen by others as racing to build a nuclear weapon as quickly as possible. If they are seen as doing that, then what we're going to see is weakening deterrence and instability in the form of arms racing and potentially preventive strikes. But if countries are able to develop enrichment and reprocessing capabilities and convince other states that they're not bent on arming with nuclear weapons, this is a recipe that can be productive for latent deterrence being successful. Now I'm going to show you some evidence that is designed to test the theory. And broadly speaking, the book looks at lots of different foreign policy contexts for evidence on this theory. And I'm going to show you evidence from one of those contexts, and then I'll briefly describe some of the other evidence that emerges from the book. But before I show you the evidence, let me just tell you a little bit more about the data set that we produced for the research that eventually went into this book. The work here initially emerged from a project that was funded by the Department of Energy that I worked on with Gerald Coles at Pacific Northwest National Lab and Paul Nelson from Texas A&M. And what we wanted to do in this project, one of the things we wanted to do, is to produce, using open source materials, a database of all enrichment and reprocessing activities going back to the beginning of the nuclear age. And over a period of several years, we collected and produced a data set that documented enrichment and reprocessing activities at 250 or so different sites in 33 different countries. In this database, we identify key information about all of these sites, including their size, whether they were laboratory scale, pilot, or commercial, what kinds of technologies were employed at these sites, and other variables as well. And this database forms the empirical backbone for the book. This is what I'm going to be using to test a lot of the ideas about latent deterrence. Now, using that database, as I said, I look at a lot of different foreign policy contexts for evidence of latent deterrence. I'm going to tell you about one of those contexts today, and that's a context of foreign policy alignment. What I'm doing here is I compiled a data set that pairs all rivals together over the period from 1946 to 2010. And within each of these rivalries, what I'm interested in is what the congruence of foreign policy preferences looks like. And I want to see how that congruence changes over time. Sometimes it becomes more congruent over time. Sometimes it becomes more divergent over time. This is going to be the outcome variable that I'm interested in. And to do this, I'm going to use a measure that's widely used in political science from Bailey et al. That produces a latent measure of a state's foreign policy preferences based on their voting at the UN. And then I'm going to use that measure to look at the similarity of the preferences in an international rivalry. My key explanatory variables are, first, whether one rival, at least one rival, has an enrichment or reprocessing capability. And then second, on the political front, whether they have exercised nuclear restraint. That is, whether they have taken measures to credibly signal that their intentions are not to race towards a nuclear weapon as quickly as possible. Now, countries can still be what we call hedging and have nuclear restraint. What they can't do is launch something like the Manhattan Project or a program like what Iraq had in the 1980s, where it's very clear that they're racing to get a nuclear weapon either as quickly as possible or very soon. But short of that, there's a lot of flirtation with nuclear weapons that can happen, and countries can still meet the threshold for restraint as I'm defining it here. So what we should see is the combination of having an enrichment or reprocessing capability and showing restraint should lead to greater congruence of foreign policy preferences in these rivalries. And importantly, that should happen because when one state gets nuclear latency, the rival should pursue a more accommodating foreign policy and pursue preferences that are more in line with the latent state, so the latent state feels less threatened. To do this, I'm going to use a variety of matching and weighting methods, which I'm happy to talk in greater detail about in the Q&A period if people are interested in. And the design of this study is meant to tell us what happens when we have a rivalry and then one country in the rivalry gets nuclear latency. What happens to the congruence of foreign policy preferences the next year and the year after that and the year after that? So let me show you some of the results from this analysis. You're looking at two different charts here that tell different stories. On the left-hand side of the slide, this is a scenario where one of the rivals gets an enrichment or reprocessing capability, and they have a restrained nuclear program, meaning that they're not racing to a bomb. So you can think about Japan as a country that would fall under this category. And what you can see here is that in this scenario, we see an improvement in the foreign policy similarity of the two rivals in years subsequent to one of them getting latency. Eventually, after about the 7th year that latency has emerged, we see that the effect washes away and is no longer significant. But for a period of several years post-latency, we do see changes in alignment that benefit the latent nuclear power. Substantively, it corresponds to about an 8 to 12% improvement in foreign policy alignment. So that's a substantively meaningful effect, but it's not a massive effect. So you're not transforming a bilateral relationship completely, but you are getting some benefit in terms of altering the preferences of your rival. When we look at the right-hand side, though, the picture is very different. Here, if you have an unrestrained nuclear program, and you can think about the Manhattan Project as one example of what that might look like, or as I said, Iraq's program in the 1980s. In these cases, when a rival gets nuclear latency, we see a worsening of foreign policy alignment within the rivalry. And this effect persists over the next 10 years. Substantively, this corresponds to between a 10 and 32% worsening in foreign policy preferences. So the effects of having an enrichment and reprocessing program very much depend on the political intentions of the latent power, and in particular, whether it's seen as racing to build a nuclear weapon or not. If it is seen as racing, the effects are likely to be negative for the latent power. But if it's not seen as racing to a bomb, they are able to obtain some benefits from an enrichment or reprocessing capability, which is consistent with what latent nuclear deterrence theory leads us to expect. From a qualitative standpoint, Henry Kissinger wrote that he thought nuclear latency would cause other countries to, quote, reorient their political alignment towards Tehran. And what I'm trying to get at in the evidence I showed you on the previous slide is this idea that it's not just about deterring military conflict, it's also about influencing the broader foreign policy preferences of other states. So was Kissinger right about this? Well, the answer depends on how others perceive Iran's intentions. If others are perceiving Iran as having a restrained nuclear program, as I'm defining it, then it would in fact be the case that Iran could gain greater political alignment with its rivals. But if Iran is seen as racing to a nuclear weapon by its rivals, then the effects would in that case be negative for Iran, and it would worsen its foreign policy alignment with rivals. Let me briefly just summarize for you some of the other evidence that's in the book. If a country has an enrichment or reprocessing program combined with political restraint, we see several benefits that emerge. First, we see a reduction in international crises in some post-latent years. Second, if the latent state is a US ally, we see an increase in troop deployments after a delayed period of several years. And we also see that in this situation, a latent power is able to deter a rival from arming with nuclear weapons. So that story is quite positive for the latent state. However, if a country has an enrichment or reprocessing program and doesn't have restraint, that is, it's seen as racing towards a nuclear weapon, in that case, we see far less reliable deterrence. We see a very large risk of preventive war or limited preventive strikes. And in this scenario, we also see arms racing, where we see rivals either trying to or successfully arming with nuclear weapons. So the overall picture, again, is nuanced. We need to know both the technological capabilities of the latent state as well as what its political intentions are in order to fully understand what the political effects will be. Let me turn now to the fifth takeaway, which is about what the implications of the findings from the book are for policy debates happening in the United States and around the world. Let's start by summarizing what we learned from the talk today. First, I've tried to introduce this concept of latent nuclear deterrence and tell you about how it works. Second, I've shown you some evidence that world leaders try this strategy, and many also believe that it works. Third, I've shown you some evidence that if you combine an enrichment or reprocessing capability with nuclear restraint, that this can often lead to successful political outcomes for the latent state. But fourth, I've also shown you that this is not a foolproof strategy, and in fact, it can backfire if countries are seen as racing to a nuclear weapon. I think that these conclusions speak to some big issues that we care about, both from an academic standpoint and from a policy standpoint. Many years ago, Thomas Schelling wrote that from now on, it will make sense to describe a country's nuclear weapons status not with a yes or no, but with a time schedule. And the book is consistent with this old idea. Rather than thinking about nuclear powers in terms of countries that have assembled weapons, my view is that we should also think about latent states as nuclear powers in their own way as well, in the sense that these states, like the nuclear weapon states, are able to obtain some political benefits from having a latent nuclear capability, even though they don't go all the way. So moving forward, I think it would be productive to get away from the binary thinking about what it means to be a nuclear power and incorporate latency into this idea. I think that this can potentially help us understand one of the big puzzles about nuclear proliferation, which is that only 10 countries have ever built bombs, despite the fact that many others have the capability of doing so, as you're seeing from this chart here. The research from the book would suggest that latent deterrence as a strategy can be a viable one for many states, in the sense that they can develop enrichment and reprocessing programs, refrain from going all the way to nuclear weapons, but still reap some political benefits while also dodging a lot of the costs that would come from going all the way and arming with a bomb. So not for every state, but for some states, this can be a productive middle ground. And I think this helps us understand why, one of the reasons why proliferation has been relatively rare. Although, of course, this is a complicated issue, and many factors help us explain the rarity of proliferation. And I think the research here has implications for thinking about nuclear disarmament as well. Now, at the present moment, disarmament might seem like a misguided pipe dream, but at various points throughout the nuclear age, in the United States and around the world, there's been thinking about whether the world would be safer or not without nuclear weapons. Well, if the existing countries that had nuclear weapons all decided to disarm, essentially they would transition from being nuclear powers with weapons to states with nuclear latency. So part of the motivation for this book is to try and understand what that hypothetical world might look like by unpacking how latent states have fared in the previous several decades. So we can't actually systematically study a hypothetical world where everybody disarms, but I think we can gain some insights about what that world might look like by understanding the history of nuclear latency. And what that history suggests is that there might be reasons to think that in a hypothetical disarmed world, countries might still be able to use nuclear deterrence, even though they don't have assembled weapons to gain political leverage. But of course, this is a very complicated issue, and no single book or study can definitively address this. My hope is that the book helps contribute to further discussion about this issue in both policymaking circles and in academia. So with that, I will conclude the presentation and look forward to your questions.